a woman robed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Now, you notice it's very common to make statues of the Virgin Mary like this. And so we'll see the Virgin Mary, with the moon under her feet and clothed with the sun. You see that in the Guadalupe picture, for instance. They're clothed with the sun. And to understand, though, what this figure here is the church. And the crown of 12 stars. Remember, I told you this book passed between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. For Gentile Christians, the crown of 12 stars refers to the 12 apostles. And for Jewish Christians, it refers to the 12 tribes of Israel, which are the crown of the community. Okay? So he says, clothed with the sun. The sun here, the basic symbol here is light. And remember that this is Johannine literature. It comes out of the Johannine community. And remember the basic light theme that you find in the Gospel account of John. Light is the big thing there. And so the church is clothed with light. The moon under her feet. One of the reasons they use the moon, it's not a big thing, I think, in Western religions. The moon is a minor deity in Western religions. But if you go into Eastern religions, the moon representing the goddess is oftentimes the major deity. And one of the reasons is, if you live in those countries like Israel, Egypt, do you know that the time of day, the only time of day you function is at night? The days are absolutely unbearable. And so for them, the moon is the one that rules the time when we live. And so very much the moon, which is always a female deity. If you were to look in the the Egyptian, you'll find that Isis is very much connected with the moon. Astarte is very much connected with the moon, and that's in Persia. And I forget the one in Ephesus, but the one in Ephesus is also Artemis. Artemis is connected with the moon. But the moon is the great deity, and the thing is, the moon is under her feet. She was with child, and she cried out in the pangs of birth, in anguish to be delivered. What is the anguish and the pain of the church giving birth? It's bringing new people into the faith. And so it is an endless and a painful process, a particularly painful process in a time of persecution, to bring others into the faith. But if we were to look at the pain in this now, look at the pain that many parents feel simply because their children are not practicing Catholicism. Okay? That is the pain of bringing to birth. Okay? And I wish, that I'm not a parent. Okay? But I would to God people had some sense of the absolute victory of Jesus. That it says in the scriptures that everything works together for the good of those who love God. All you have to do is love God, and he fixes it, because that's the only way it can work to your good. Make sure, rather than do anything to try and convert your children, make sure you love God. If you love God, it has to ultimately work for your good, period, however it is. And however it is actually then becomes his problem. Okay? Then a second sign appeared in the heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 diadems on its heads. I brought a case of coins here, and if you want to afterwards, you're welcome to come up and see them. These coins are original coins of the Roman emperors, and I began them with Augustus because he was the first Roman emperor. But for what we're talking about, he doesn't count, okay? The persecution began with Tiberius. So Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero. Nero was assassinated, and after Nero, there are 3 emperors whom you may never have heard of. One was called Galba, one was Otho, and one was Vitellius. And the reason why most people haven't heard of them, they all ruled in 1 year. There was chaos after Nero. Okay? And so these guys came in one by one. Now you have to understand, when an emperor came in, his highest priority was not the persecution of the church. Okay, so do you remember they mentioned the 10 and then the 7? There were 10 emperors during this period, but only 7 were involved in the persecution. These 2 died before they could get to persecuting Christians. Okay? So these 3, while they're emperors, and they were dead set against Christianity, just didn't have a time to do anything about it. Okay? They were followed by Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. Now I want you to know that after Domitian there were other Roman emperors, but the fact of the matter is that the fact that they end with the 10 probably gives you a very good insight into the date of the book itself. And Domitian died in 96. So that probably gives us a good insight into the period that's covered. But they mention the 10, which are the 10 emperors, but they mention only the 7 that are dangerous to the church. Okay? So this dragon had 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 diadems on the heads. Okay? And why the use of the dragon? You remember that the dragon, the same word dragon, it basically means reptile. So while we use dragon here, in the book of Genesis, we would refer to it as a snake. And when we're talking about Egypt, we refer to it as a crocodile. But it is the reptile that represents evil, okay? Whatever it is at the particular time. So, and his tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and hurled them to the earth. Okay? And I think you know, like with regards to the alligator particularly, the most dangerous part of the alligator is really the tail. The alligator has a very, very powerful tail. And when people are dealing with alligators, they're very concerned with the mouth. It looks very vicious, and believe me, can do work too. But the thing is, you tend to concentrate on that. And people who are killed by alligators are usually killed by being tripped up by the tail. If an alligator were to swing his tail and hit you in the legs, he could break both your legs with a single swap. Could break your back, anything, okay? And so the mention here is 1/3 of the stars of heaven. I'm sure you know that there are passages in Scripture that talk about the angels that were lost. Okay, now remember the stars refer to the angels, that the Jews believe the stars are these little holes where the angels watch what's going on. So to sweep 1/3 of the stars from heaven to earth are the angels that are lost. Okay, refers to that. They hurled them down to earth. The dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when her child was born, he might devour it. So the dragon awaits those who are born into the church, and those who are born into the church, those are the ones the demon goes after. The demon does not go after people not born into this relationship with God, because the demon already owns them. It doesn't need to be bothered at all. Okay? And you'll notice that if you look at the life of Jesus, that's one of the great symbolisms that goes on in the life of Jesus. Do you remember that the only time we see him really encounter Satan is immediately after his baptism? Okay, so we have the baptism in the Jordan, and then he's driven into the desert by the demon so that he can be tempted. And that's always the demon waiting because the baptism of Jesus was when Jesus publicly took on his ministry. And we have no reason to believe that Satan knew who Jesus was at any time before that. But then he knew he was. Then he took him into the desert to be tempted. St. Augustine tells us that one of the great things to understand about being a believer is the temptations that you and I undergo in our lives are actually a sign of our salvation rather than the reverse. That it's because we are saved that Satan is that way. And I've mentioned to you before, I'm sure, that one of the really interesting things about reptiles is reptiles are more active dead than they are alive. So I don't know if any of you have ever cut the head of a snake, but if you cut the head off a snake, the snake will writhe and throw like you've never seen the snake in life. And that's because reptiles are almost entirely muscle. And once the control of the muscle is removed, once they die, then it all, goes on. And St. Augustine says that Satan always appears to be more active after he's dead. He shares that with the reptiles, that once Satan is actually defeated within us, then we somehow feel we're all tempted and all this sort of thing. But the fact of the matter is that is the death throes of the demon. He says, she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is destined to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. Okay? So the child, of course, that's given birth here, the child that the church gives birth to is Jesus. And you would say, that the church was born of Jesus. But remember, we're talking two communities here, the Jewish community and the Christian. Jesus is born of the Jewish community. And then the Christian community is born of him. Okay? And in each case, God finds a way to protect the community. The woman, that is the church, fled to the desert. Now, the desert is basically where you and I live. It is the world where the temptations, remember the temptations of Jesus, it's a world where the temptations and the difficulties are, and that's where the woman goes, where she had a place prepared by God that she might be sustained for 1,260 days. You recognize that number again, okay? And so the church is there, and the church is to be sustained. Now, what does it mean to be sustained through this period of persecution where we're told Jesus is coming, it's over? Don't know. Okay? So then we go on. Then a war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon with his angels fought back, and he did not prevail, nor had they any place anymore in heaven. Okay? So the thing that you've been told about, the angels rebelling against God and falling out of heaven and everything, that this is where that story comes from. Okay? That these angels left. The guy who wrote Lord of the Rings has written a very interesting book on the thing of the fall of the angels. And his book, one of the things that we don't think much about today, but was a big thing with the Greeks, was what was called the harmony of the spheres. They believed that a music took place in heaven with regards to... So anyway, Tolkien builds his thing on that. He says that there is a symphony that God puts together, and the head violinist is Lucifer. And the head violinist has his part in it, and he's the best violinist and all this sort of thing, the best musician in the whole thing. But Lucifer decides his part just isn't quite big enough, so he adds a few more notes. And all the musicians in the orchestra have the opportunity to adjust to Lucifer's few more notes, or to refuse to adjust away from the written thing. And those who adjust to Lucifer's notes are lost. And those who don't constitute those who remain in heaven. Okay? And one of the reasons why I like it is, having worked in art and a little bit in music, but not, in the singing or playing instrument, but having worked with musicians, one of the things you don't want is a musician who can't follow directions. The best musician in the entire world who can't follow directions will ruin anything, flat out ruin it. So you can't have the person there. Okay? The great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent who is called the devil. Now remember the ancient serpent? Now that's a reference to Genesis. This is the same guy all the way through. Okay? Who is called the devil and the Satan, the deceiver of the entire world, was thrown down to the earth, and his angels with him. I'd like to look at the deceiver of the entire earth. One of the things to understand about Scripture, and this is true through the Bible, when you look at the Bible and decide between the saved and the lost, you would think the dividing line is between the good and the bad. But I will tell you about a man who was saved, a murderer and an adulterer, David. Okay? You'll find an awful lot of rotten people saved. Okay? And you'll find a lot of good people lost, the Pharisees. The distinction between the damned and the saved is not between the good and the bad. The distinction between the damned and the saved is distinction between the honest and the dishonest. People who lie live in the kingdom of Satan. Satan is ultimately the deceiver, and Jesus is ultimately the truth. Now, someone who is absolutely honest, let me take David or Mary Magdalene or any of these people, someone who is absolutely honest will one day come to recognize their problems and change. But the liar, constantly covers it. See, the Pharisees were not perfect. They were very good, but they weren't perfect. And they pretended to be perfect, so they never improved. David was an SOB. He knew it, he said so, and he changed. The distinction between the saved and the damned has to do with honesty and dishonesty. The most dangerous snake in anyone's life is lying. It's more dangerous than murder and adultery. Lying will ultimately cause a person to be lost. You can recover almost anything else. So, and I heard a loud voice in heaven proclaim, "Now is the sovereignty, salvation, and power and sovereignty of our God and the authority of his Christ." Okay? So salvation is that we are brought out of what we're in, we're saved. The power is something that is intrinsic to God himself. The sovereignty is the rulership, particularly they're thinking of rulership over countries. Who's been their danger here? The Roman emperor. So what they're proclaiming here is actually the emperor of Rome is God. Ultimately, when push comes to shove, God is the emperor of Rome. And the authority of Christ. Remember, authority is something given to you by someone above. It's not intrinsic like power. And when Jesus came among us, he was given authority by the Father. The Father gave Jesus authority on the face of the earth. Okay? For the accuser of our brothers and sisters is driven out, he who accused them day and night before our God. Well, this is another thing to notice. Another title of Satan is the accuser. Satan is the one who constantly accuses. You know, if you think about it for a moment, the God who created the universe actually created it in favor of himself. And one of the things that you and I as human beings have is a real blindness to personal problems. It is practically a charismatic gift. But we are totally blinded to the problems in our own life, while we have an amazing ability to find the slightest hint of them in anyone, or usually everyone else, okay? And there's two ways to deal with that. When I discover what's wrong with you, and I'm very good at it, but when I discover what's wrong with you, I have two ways of dealing with that. Number one, I can accuse you. And that actually is an act of Satan. Satan is the accuser. So I can accuse you. Or the second thing is I might look in my heart and figure out why I noticed it. And if I do, I'll become a better person. There is a reason why I noticed it. And it has nothing to do with you. But there is a reason why I noticed that particular problem. Have you ever noticed that there's some people around you who seem to be relatively good, who just drive you crazy because of some little quirk? And there are people around you who are really rotten, you just get along with. The fact is, you and I don't really pick out faults in people. It's something in us that causes us to notice this particular thing in this person. Okay, whether a good person or a bad person, we notice this. But that actually is one of the great tools of personal perfection. Every time you notice something wrong in somebody else, if you're like me, it's very easy and very common. But as soon as you notice something wrong in someone else, the question is, why does that bother me? That's the way to renovate our lives. So, they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb, by the testimony they bore, for love of life did not bring them to shrink from death. That, incidentally, is a verse we constantly use in the church on the Feast of Martyrs. The love of life did not force them to shrink from death. Remember, Jesus will say that in the scriptures. The one who loves his life is going to lose it. The one who hates his life for my sake will have it to life everlasting. The fact is, the greatest hindrance to human life is the fear of dying. The fear of dying causes us to miss all kinds of things we could enjoy. And every one of us has a fear of death to some extent, okay? And incidentally, the fear of death, that's one of the reasons why kids have so much fun. They don't know what to be afraid of yet, okay? And they can enjoy all kinds of things that no one in their right mind would be doing, you know. By right mind, I mean us, okay? So this idea of the fear of death gradually imprisons a life. And you and I, well, that's one of the greatest things a psychologist can do. One of the greatest things a psychologist helps you to do is constantly track the areas of your life where the fear of living, because don't think of it as fear of death. Think of it as the fear of living. You're afraid of fully living because you'll die. I'll tell you a secret. You're going to die anyway. Might as well live. Might as well live. You're going to die anyway. So this idea of don't allow the fear of death to limit your life. Okay? He says, "Rejoice then, you heavens, and you that dwell in them. But woe to you, earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great fury, knowing that his time is short." And actually, when you see that in the original text, it says, knowing that his time is over. Jesus' triumph is complete, so the devil comes to earth because it's finished. It's all over. Okay? And so now, 12:13. When the dragon saw that he'd been thrown to earth, he went in pursuit of the woman who'd given birth to the male child. Satan is no longer able to defeat God. He and his angels have been tossed out of heaven. That's over. So what do? Then we pursue the people of God, which is the Jewish community, the Christian community. We pursue the church. But the woman was given 2 great eagle's wings so that she could fly to a place in the desert where she was sustained for a time, times, and half a time. 3 years. A time, times, half a time. 3.5 years. Whatever this period of the thing is. Okay? Away from the serpent. So somehow God preserves and protects the church. Then the serpent spewed a flood of water over the woman to sweep her away in its flood. But the earth came to the assistance of the woman and opened its mouth and swallowed the river, which the dragon spewed from his mouth. Now all we know is that this symbolizes some great thing that Satan moves against the community that ultimately is destroyed. But you notice the similarities if we look at the Exodus story where the water is parted and the Jews, the text says, walked on dry ground. The idea is the dry ground through the water. Okay? So the dragon was furious with the woman and went off to wage war on the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commandments and the testimony of Jesus. And he took his stand on the seashore. Okay? So what happens is the church as an entity, and what we traditionally have called Holy Mother Church, people don't tend to use that term, but this is the text that comes from, Holy Mother the Church. Holy Mother the Church is safe. The demon doesn't deal with Holy Mother the Church, but he deals with individual believers, deals with the offspring. So Satan goes after the offspring and is seated, took his seat on the seashore. And the seat on the seashore probably again refers to the city of Rome. Rome at this time, believe it or not, was a great sea power. And it operated out of, if you ever get a chance to visit the city of Rome, one of the things that very few people visit, but you should really go to if you can, called Ostia Antigua. Ostia Antigua is the original port for the city of Rome, and it's a huge city of buildings, all of which are totally intact and all of which are empty. They had a great typhoid epidemic break out there. The city was totally abandoned, never destroyed, totally abandoned. And then they moved up into the city of Rome and left that area. But what happened originally, in order to protect the city of Rome, that Ostia Antigua was the port city. And so when you brought anything to Rome, it all took place in Ostia Antigua and then was taken by barge up the Tiber to Rome. okay? But by the time you had the outbreak and everything in Ostia Antigua, Rome was so powerful they didn't worry about anything. Rome didn't even have a wall around the city at that point. And so that they allowed this stuff to come up, and Ostia Antigua was gone. So the reference to the seashore is most probably, again, a reference to the city of Rome. And I think it's to remind us that at any time in history, the real focus, the visible focus of satanic power is always in a political movement. Okay? It is always in a political movement. And the political movement that we would see today, and I need to tell you I have no great insight into this, but the political movement that I see in the world today is fundamentalism. Whether we're talking fundamentalist Christians, or we're talking fundamentalist Muslims, or fundamentalist Jews, or fundamentalist Buddhists, or fundamentalist Hindus, they are killing people all over the world. Fundamentalists are the great danger in the world today. And you see that as a terrible thing. If we were to go back a few years, I would say it was the communists. You go back before that, I'd say it was the Nazis. But you can almost look at history. And, if you look very carefully at it, and you have to look at world history, because each country thinks they have their own problems. Like, I think, depending on what your political party is, we in the United States would really like to nail it on the opposite political party. That is the satanic movement in the world today. But trust me, we don't even know what satanic movements are in this country. You really have to see them elsewhere. But what's going on, I think, in fundamentalism is the thing. So then, out of the sea, I saw a beast rising with 10 horns, 7 heads. On its horns were 10 diadems, and each head a blasphemous name. Okay? Now remember, this again reference city of Rome and the 10 emperors and the 7 that had authority. The thing to notice here is each head had a blasphemous name. Now, do you remember that to be blasphemous, you must claim to be God. And every one of the Roman emperors did. And so their name became blasphemous because it was the name of a god. Okay? Each of the Roman emperors thought they were God. The beast I saw was like a leopard, but its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth like a lion's mouth. You find a description like this very similar in the book of Daniel. Okay? And what it is probably a reference to, people like to see, like for instance, the bear as a reference to Russia and the lion as a reference to England. And they like to see these as the symbols of set countries. But remember the what we call the cherub. The cherub always has these qualities. The Egyptian cherub is the Sphinx. The Chinese cherub is that dog that they put at the door of the thing that guards them. And you'd find in each society they have a mythical character that's usually a mix of a number of qualities of animals that they see as a powerful protector. And so this is one of these. The dragon conferred its own power, its throne, and its great authority. Okay? So the dragon, which is Satan, gives its power and authority to this entity, whatever it is that's opposing the church. In the same way, Jesus has passed power and authority into his entity, which is the church. So that as Jesus forgave sins, so the church forgives sins. As Satan is trying to lead people into sin, so the political movement that follows Satan is trying to lead people into sin. So you have the authority and the community that carries out that authority, both for God and Satan. Okay? And we'll call it there, which is 13:3. Incidentally, anyone who would like to, when we're finished, is more than welcome to come up and look at these coins. Don't take them home. Let's see if there are any questions